The celebration didn't happen on a stage. It didn't happen with medals or speeches. It happened quietly, in private messages, veteran group chats, and late-night phone calls. Here's the shocking question no one expected to ask. Why were wounded veterans smiling when Prince Harry was removed as patron of the Invictus Games? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. That question alone flips the entire public narrative on its head. For years, the world was told a simple story. Invictus was Harry's legacy, his mission, his proof of purpose after leaving royal life. We were shown emotional speeches, dramatic embraces, standing ovations. But behind those polished moments, something else was happening, something far less comfortable. Because while the cameras were rolling, frustration was growing. And when the announcement finally came that Harry had been sacked as patron ahead of the 2027 Invictus Games in the UK, the expected outrage never arrived. No veteran backlash, no mass resignations, no open revolt. Instead, there was relief. That's the part nobody wants to explain. Why now? Why before 2027? And why did the decision come not from the palace, not from politicians, but from the CEO of the Invictus Games himself? Let's be clear, this wasn't just a personnel change. This was symbolic, strategic, and deeply uncomfortable for anyone who believed Invictus and Prince Harry were inseparable. Because the 2027 Games aren't just another host year. They're coming home to the UK, to the birthplace of the Invictus idea, to a country where military culture, scrutiny, and tradition collide head-on with celebrity optics. And suddenly, the question wasn't, can Invictus survive without Harry? It was, can Invictus survive with him? That's a very different conversation. Behind closed doors, veterans had been asking hard questions for a long time. Who is this really for? Who gets hurt? Who decides what matters more, recovery or reputation? Some veterans felt invisible. Others felt spoken for. And a growing number felt that the games meant to honor them were slowly becoming something else entirely. Here's the contradiction that matters most. Invictus was created to restore dignity, not distraction. To center wounded service members, not personalities. So when leadership finally acted, it wasn't sudden. It was the end of a long build-up. Quiet meetings, careful wording, a line drawn where none had existed before. And when word spread through the veteran community, the reaction stunned everyone watching from the outside. Because instead of anger, there was celebration. Not loud, not public, but unmistakable. And that raises one unsettling thought. If removing the founder's most famous champion brought relief, what does that say about what was really happening inside Invictus? Because the truth is, this decision wasn't about disrespect. It was about control, about identity, about who the games truly belonged to. And just as that realization began to sink in, another question emerged, one that would shift the entire story in a direction no one expected. Because if veterans were relieved by Harry's exit, what exactly pushed leadership to finally act? The fracture didn't start with a scandal. It started with silence. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people missed. Prince Harry didn't fall out with Invictus overnight. He slowly drifted away from the very people the games were built for, and many of them noticed long before the public did. At the beginning, it felt different. Raw, personal, purpose-driven. Veterans remember those early days vividly. There was no red carpet energy. No branding buzzwords. No carefully staged photo ops. It was about recovery, pain, resilience, and brotherhood. Harry wasn't just a patron then. He was present, listening, engaged. So what changed? That's the question veterans started asking quietly, among themselves, years before anyone dared ask it out loud. As Invictus grew, so did its profile. Bigger sponsors, bigger stages, bigger cameras. And with that growth came something subtle but corrosive, a shift in focus. The stories became cleaner, the messaging tighter, the moments more polished. Too polished. Some veterans began to feel like extras in a production rather than the heart of the mission. Invitations felt scripted. Conversations felt managed. Decisions felt distant. Here's the contradiction that stung the most. A games designed to give veterans their voice began speaking for them instead. Was it intentional? Maybe not. But intention doesn't erase impact. Behind the scenes, veterans noticed how often discussions centered on optics, on press reactions, on who would be present and how it would look. fewer conversations about long-term recovery support, fewer chances to challenge decisions, fewer moments where veterans felt truly heard. And when concerns were raised, they weren't met with hostility, they were met with politeness, smiles, reassurances, and then nothing changed. That's when frustration turns into resignation. Ask yourself this. How many times can someone feel sidelined before they stop speaking up altogether? The irony was painful. Invictus was supposed to empower wounded service members to reclaim control over their narrative. Yet many felt that narrative slipping through their fingers, replaced by something safer, more marketable, more controllable. And as Prince Harry's public life became increasingly controversial, veterans found themselves dragged into conversations they never asked to be part of. Media coverage blurred lines. Critics no longer separated the games from the man. And veterans, the very people Invictus exists to protect, bore the emotional weight of that association. Some began to ask a dangerous question. Is the patron helping the mission or complicating it? That question reached leadership long before it reached headlines. Internal discussions started quietly, not about loyalty, not about betrayal, but about sustainability. About whether the Games could enter the UK in 2027 carrying baggage that had nothing to do with service or sacrifice. Because the UK wouldn't treat Invictus like just another international event. It would scrutinize everything, every face, every message, every contradiction. And that's when leadership realized something crucial. This wasn't about the past. It was about the future. The Games were at risk of becoming defined by one individual instead of thousands of veterans. And once that realization settled in, the relationship between Harry and Invictus was no longer a given. It was a liability question. But what finally tipped the balance wasn't media pressure or public opinion. It was a moment when veterans stopped asking to be heard and leadership started listening. And when that happened, the decision that followed would shock the world and quietly vindicate those who had felt invisible for far too long. Scott Moore didn't make a speech. He didn't leak a warning. He didn't test the waters in public. He acted. And that alone tells you how serious things had become. Here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. CEOs don't challenge royal-linked figures unless the cost of doing nothing is higher than the backlash of acting. Scott Moore is not a reckless man. He's a numbers and mission executive, which means by the time the decision was made, the debate was already over. So what changed? The answer lies in timing and pressure. With the 2027 Invictus Games returning to the UK, every unresolved tension suddenly mattered more. Funding scrutiny intensified. Government partnerships came with conditions. Veteran organizations demanded clarity. And the media, already sharpening its knives, prepared to examine every contradiction under a microscope. Invictus could no longer afford ambiguity. Here's the uncomfortable contradiction Moore had to confront. Invictus was being praised globally, yet internally, confidence was fraying. Veterans were participating, but many no longer felt ownership. The Games were growing, but the mission was blurring. And in leadership meetings, one question kept resurfacing, sharper each time. Can we protect Invictus without redefining its figurehead? Moore listened where others deflected. He read feedback others minimized. He noticed patterns others dismissed as noise. Veterans weren't angry, they were tired. Tired of feeling secondary. Tired of explaining that criticism of a patron wasn't betrayal of a cause. That distinction matters. Because once veterans felt safe enough to speak honestly, the message became impossible to ignore. They wanted Invictus to stand on its own. They wanted the mission to be louder than the messenger. And Moore understood something critical. The UK wouldn't accept a charity blurred by controversy, no matter how noble its origins. Not in 2027. Not on home soil. Not with veterans at the center. So the line was drawn quietly, professionally, with devastating clarity. Harry wasn't removed in anger. He was removed to protect the Games. That's what made the reaction so startling. When word reached the veteran community, there was no outrage campaign, no open letters, no backlash storm. Instead, there were private messages of thanks, subtle acknowledgments, a sense that someone had finally made the hard call no one else would. And that reaction told Moore everything he needed to know. Because leadership isn't about pleasing the loudest voices. It's about safeguarding the mission when the noise threatens to drown it out. But here's where the story takes a sharper turn. Because once Harry was gone, something unexpected happened. Veterans began speaking more freely, more honestly, without hesitation, and what they revealed next would reshape how the world understands Invictus, and why this decision may have saved it from something far worse. The celebration wasn't about Prince Harry leaving. It was about something returning. Control. For the first time in a long while, veterans felt the games were theirs again. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when Harry was removed as patron, a strange thing happened almost immediately. The tension that had hung quietly over veteran circles began to lift. Conversations changed tone. People spoke more openly. Concerns that had once been whispered were suddenly said out loud, not in anger, but in relief. Ask yourself this. Why does silence break only after someone powerful exits the room? Veterans began describing the same feeling in different words. Less pressure, less expectation to perform gratitude, less fear of being misunderstood or misrepresented. The mission felt cleaner, simpler, closer to what it was always meant to be. And that's where the celebration came from. Not disrespect, not bitterness, but validation. For years, some veterans had worried that speaking honestly would be seen as disloyal. That questioning leadership meant undermining recovery efforts. That criticizing optics meant disrespecting sacrifice. Those fears kept many quiet. Harry's removal shattered that illusion. It sent a message no press release ever could. Invictus belongs to the veterans, not to any single individual. That message matters deeply as the Games look ahead to 2027 in the UK. Because this isn't just another host nation, it's the spiritual home of Invictus. And returning there without unresolved tensions was essential. Leadership understood that. Veterans felt it. And suddenly, the future felt lighter. But here's the twist no one expected. The removal didn't weaken Invictus, it strengthened it. With the spotlight diffused, attention shifted back where it belongs. To recovery programs, to peer support, to long-term care, to stories that didn't need celebrity framing to matter. And quietly, behind the scenes, Invictus began rebuilding trust, not with donors or media, but with its own community. That's the part critics don't know how to respond to. Because the usual narrative says removing a high-profile patron should cause chaos. Instead, it brought clarity. And that clarity raised a bigger, more uncomfortable question for the future of charity leadership everywhere. How many causes have confused visibility with value? As Invictus prepares for 2027, it stands at a crossroads. A chance to redefine itself not as a brand, but as a platform. Not as a spectacle, but as a support system. And while the world debates what this means for Prince Harry, veterans are focused on something else entirely. They're asking whether this moment will finally allow Invictus to become what it was always meant to be: unfiltered, veteran-led, and resilient. But there's one final reckoning still ahead. Because if removing Harry restored trust inside Invictus, what does that say about the structures that allowed things to drift in the first place? And more importantly, who else might be watching and rethinking everything they thought they knew about leadership, legacy, and letting go? So let's return to the question that opened this story, the one that felt almost uncomfortable to ask. Why were veterans celebrating? Not because someone fell, but because something finally stood up. Invictus was never meant to orbit a person. It was meant to anchor a community. And somewhere along the way, that anchor began to drift. Slowly, quietly, almost politely, until veterans felt it in their bones before anyone saw it in headlines. This moment, Harry's removal as patron, wasn't a rejection of gratitude or history. It was a correction, a reset, a line drawn not in anger, but in responsibility. Think about that for a second. How many organizations have the courage to choose mission over myth? How many leaders are willing to risk backlash to protect the people they serve rather than the image that attracts applause? Scott Moore made a decision that most people in his position avoid. He chose the harder path, and in doing so, he revealed a truth that's bigger than Invictus. Visibility is not the same as value. For years, the spotlight was treated like proof of impact. But real impact happens when the cameras leave. When veterans talk to veterans. When recovery isn't a talking point, but a long, difficult, unglamorous process. And now, as the Invictus Games prepare to return to the UK in 2027, something feels different. Lighter, quieter, more honest. The Games are no longer defined by who stands at the podium, but by who crosses the finish line, scarred, resilient, and unfiltered. That's the legacy veterans wanted back. And here's the part that should give everyone pause. If Invictus needed this reckoning to survive, how many other charities are still avoiding theirs? How many causes have mistaken loyalty for silence? How many missions have been softened to protect personalities? Because once veterans realized their voices mattered more than optics, there was no going back. This wasn't the end of Invictus's story. It was the end of an illusion. So the next time you hear someone ask whether the games can succeed without Prince Harry, maybe the better question is this. What else can succeed once it finally listens to the people it was built for? If this story made you uncomfortable, good. That means it mattered. If it surprised you, share it. If you believe veterans should always come before branding, say it out loud. Because the real victory here wasn't a medal. It was reclaiming the mission. And as Invictus steps into its next chapter, one thing is certain. The spotlight may fade, but purpose doesn't. And this time, the veterans are holding it firmly in their own hands.